You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The blood on my keyboard had dried to a rusty brown, but I kept typing anyway. My fingers moved without conscious thought, guided by something that wasn't quite me anymore. Outside my apartment window, Chicago burned in the distance, not with fire, but with a darkness that consumed light itself. The thing that had once been Ashwood Manor was spreading, just as I'd helped it plan during those final days when I still believed I had a choice. Let me tell you how this started, while I still remember being human. My name was Theodore Hartwell, and I used to believe that evil was something you could expose with enough research and determination. I'd spent 10 years as an investigative journalist before launching my podcast, Shadows and Whispers, which focused on allegedly supernatural cases that law enforcement had abandoned. Most turned out to be hoaxes or misunderstandings, but the few genuine cases I'd uncovered had built me a reputation among people who took such things seriously. That reputation is what killed me, though my body didn't realize it for weeks. The notification appeared on my laptop at exactly 3:33 a.m. on a Tuesday night in October. I'd been researching a series of disappearances in rural Vermont, 17 people over the past century, all of them found dead with expressions of pure terror frozen on their faces. The coroner's reports were inconsistent, listing everything from heart failure to hypothermia, but the one constant was their location, all within a 5-mile radius of something called Ashwood Manor. The browser tab opened itself. I hadn't clicked anything, hadn't even touched the trackpad, but suddenly I was staring at a website I'd never seen before. Phantom Estate Sales, read the header, the letters seeming to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. Below the header was a single property listing that made my breath catch in my throat. Ashwood Manor, Gothic revival, 1891, 47 rooms, 200 acres of pristine Adirondack wilderness. Current bid, $37,000. The photographs were impossible. Not because they showed anything overtly supernatural, but because they captured beauty so perfect it hurt to look at. Soaring cathedral ceilings with hand-painted murals that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. Mahogany paneling that gleamed like liquid amber, its grain forming patterns that looked almost like faces. A pipe organ that filled an entire wall of what the caption labelled as the conservatory, its pipes arranged in configurations that suggested music I'd never heard, but somehow remembered. But it was the main hall that stopped my heart. The photograph showed a grandfather clock standing in the centre of a spiral staircase, but instead of a traditional clock face, it displayed the phases of the moon. And in that frozen moment captured by the camera, I could swear I saw one of the moon phase images wink at me. I checked the bidding timer, 11 minutes remaining. As I watched, other bidders drove the price up incrementally. 40,000, 55, 68. Real money for what should have been a multi-million-dollar property. I found myself creating an account on the site, my fingers moving faster than my brain could process the implications. The other bidders were aggressive, pushing the price towards 6 figures with mechanical precision. Then, at exactly 3:44 a.m, every single one of them withdrew simultaneously. The price dropped back to 37,000, and a new message appeared in the bidding box, reserved for T. Hartwell. Accept inheritance. I hadn't entered my name anywhere on the site. My finger hovered over the accept button for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Every instinct I'd developed as a journalist screamed warnings about fraud, identity theft, elaborate cons. But something deeper than instinct was pulling me toward that button, a hunger I'd never felt before, the desperate need to know what secrets the Manor held. I clicked accept. Welcome home appeared on the screen, followed by an address in handwritten script that looked like it had been penned with a quill. Your inheritance includes more than mere property. Expect delivery within the hour. My phone rang before I could close the laptop. The caller ID showed only a string of numbers that hurt to look at directly. Theodore? Came a woman's voice, ancient and crackling with static that sounded like whispers. I am Evangeline Ashwood, keeper of the bloodline's final obligations. You have accepted what cannot be returned. The keys will arrive shortly, along with the accumulated wisdom of your predecessors. I do hope you understand that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The line went dead, but I could still hear her voice echoing in my apartment walls. 43 minutes later, my doorbell rang. The sound was wrong. Instead of the electronic chime I was used to, it tolled like a church bell, deep and resonant. Through the peephole, I saw a man in an old-fashioned courier uniform, holding an antique wooden box that seemed to absorb the hallway light around it. Delivery for the new master of Ashwood Manor, he said when I opened the door. His voice sounded like grinding stone, and when he smiled his teeth were too sharp and too numerous. Sign here, please. The contract was written in Latin, the letters seeming to move and rearrange themselves as I tried to read them. But I signed anyway, my hand guided by that same inexplicable hunger for knowledge that had led me to accept the inheritance. The moment my signature was complete, the courier vanished. Not walked away, not disappeared around a corner. Simply ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next, leaving behind only the scent of old graves and older secrets. The box was bound with iron chains that felt ice cold even through my gloves. Inside, nestled in velvet that had once been white, but was now the colour of dried blood, I found 3 skeleton keys, each one different and all of them somehow wrong. They were too heavy for their size, too warm for metal, and when I held them, I could hear distant screaming. Beneath the keys lay a daguerreotype photograph showing Ashwood Manor as it had appeared in 1891. But as I stared at the image, tiny figures began moving in the windows, pale shapes that pressed against the glass from the inside, their mouths open in silent cries for help. The leather-bound journal was the final item, thick with pages that had been added over decades. The cover was unmarked, except for a single word burned into the leather: inheritance. When I opened it, the pages released the smell of roses and formaldehyde, a combination that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1891, written in elegant Victorian script. I, Cornelius Ashwood, do hereby establish these commandments for the preservation of sanity within this house. What I have constructed extends beyond mere architecture into realms where human understanding dissolves like salt in acid. I have opened doors that should have remained sealed for eternity, and now something vast and patient watches from the spaces between spaces. Future inheritors must follow these precepts exactly, for deviation means not death, but transformation into something that death cannot touch. The handwriting changed on the next page, different ink, different pen, different decade. A woman's hand shaking with terror. Margaret Thornfield, 1923. Cornelius lied. These aren't protections, they're feeding instructions. The house grows stronger with each rule we follow, each fear we feel, each scream we swallow. But stopping means something worse than oblivion. I've seen what happens to those who refuse to play its games. More entries followed, 7 different hands spanning a century of horror. Each owner had added their own experiences, their own desperate warnings, their own bargains with forces beyond human comprehension. The final entry was dated just 3 months ago. David Chen, final entry. The hunger is spreading beyond the house now. I can feel it reaching through me, using my knowledge of urban planning to identify new locations for its offspring. Chicago, Los Angeles, New York. It wants to birth itself into every major city. The 8th inheritor will be the key to its expansion. Don't be the 8th. Please God, don't be the 8th. But I was the 8th. I could feel the number burning into my consciousness as I read, settling into my bones like a cancer made of mathematics. The rules themselves were written across multiple pages, each one annotated with increasingly desperate marginalia from previous owners. Rule 1. The bell tower chimes every 3 hours from 6 a.m. to midnight. Should it chime at any other time, immediately proceed to the conservatory and play the Song of Summoning from page 394 of the Crimson Hymnal. The melody must be performed exactly 3 times. Failure to complete this ritual will alert the watchers to your presence, and they do not forgive interruptions to their rest. Margaret's note in the margin. The song isn't summoning anything new, it's calling back pieces of yourself that the house has already taken. Each time you play it, you become less human. Rule 2. Never enter the wine cellar when the temperature drops below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Consult the brass thermometer in the kitchen before any descent. The cold brings them up from the deep places, and human warmth is irresistible to things that have been frozen for millennia. David's scrawled addition. The thermometer lies after the first week. Check your breath. If you can see it, don't go down. Rule 3. If you hear a woman singing opera in the language of unbeing, do not seek the source. Go directly to the library and read aloud from any crimson-bound tome until the singing ceases. She was the first to understand what Cornelius had done, and her knowledge is too terrible for living minds to contain. Multiple hands had written here, cover your ears first, even hearing the words can change you. Rule 4. The grandfather clock displays lunar phases instead of mortal time. When the moon shows black, remain only in rooms with active fireplaces and maintain the flames throughout the night. During the dark moon, they hunt by heat signature, and cold blood is the only camouflage that works. A note in different ink. The fires must be fed with something personal each hour. Hair, fingernails, blood if necessary. The flames need pieces of you to hide your true nature. Rule 5. Children may appear in the gardens during winter months. They are not children. They are not alive. They are not entirely dead. Close all ground floor shutters and remain upstairs until spring melts their footprints. They cannot climb stairs, but they can wait. They have waited before. Someone had crossed out "cannot climb stairs" and written "cannot climb wooden stairs." Emily Hartwell died when they started using the stone steps. Stone remembers. Wood forgets. Rule 6. The portrait of Cornelius Ashwood in the dining room must never face the wall. If you discover it reversed, evacuate through the kitchen door immediately and shelter in the gardener's cottage until dawn. When the portrait turns, he is hunting, and walls cannot contain his attention. The marginalia here was just one word, repeated dozens of times in different hands. Run, 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 run. Rule 7. If the pipe organ plays without human intervention, retreat to the master bedroom and cover all reflective surfaces with the provided black cloths. The music opens doors between dimensions, and the things that use those doors exist primarily in reflection. They must not see themselves in our reality, for that would make them solid. A note in Margaret's hand. It's not about them seeing themselves, it's about them seeing you in the reflection and realizing you're real. Rule 8. Every 7th day place a lit candle in each window facing the forest. Should any candle extinguish before dawn, evacuate immediately and remain away for 72 hours. The Forest Collective will attempt to reclaim their ancestral feeding ground, and they process organic matter in ways that leave the consciousness intact but distributed among trees. David's final edition. By the 8th week, you'll want to let the candles die. Don't. Whatever you become after they take you is worse than death. I know because I've seen my predecessors in the bark patterns still screaming silently after decades. I should have burned the journal. I should have thrown the keys in Lake Michigan and moved to another state. Instead, I spent the rest of the night researching everything I could find about Ashwood Manor and coming up empty. The internet seemed to actively resist searches related to the property. Results would disappear as I clicked on them. Photographs would corrupt as they loaded, and more than once my computer crashed when I got too close to useful information. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was going to Ashwood Manor, not as a victim but as an investigator. I would document everything, expose the truth behind the disappearances, and finally get the answers that had eluded law enforcement for over a century. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life. The drive to the Adirondacks took 6 hours, following increasingly narrow roads that seemed to exist only when I needed them. Twice my GPS lost signal entirely, but the handwritten map included with the journal guided me unerringly through turns that shouldn't have been there and past landmarks that didn't appear on any official survey. The forest grew denser as I approached the manor, the trees pressing closer to the road until I was driving through a tunnel of interwoven branches that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. The silence was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, no wind in the leaves. Even my car engine seemed muffled, as if the forest was absorbing sound itself. Then the trees ended, and Ashwood Manor rose before me like a fever dream made of stone and shadow. The photographs hadn't captured its true scale. The main structure soared 4 stories into the grey sky, its Gothic spires and flying buttresses creating a silhouette that seemed to bend reality around itself. Wings extended from the central building like the arms of a massive cross, and a bell tower rose from the southern end, its bells visible through open arches that reminded me uncomfortably of eye sockets. But it was the windows that made my skin crawl. There were too many of them, arranged in patterns that followed no architectural logic I could understand. Some were round, others pointed, still others shaped like symbols from forgotten alphabets, and every single one was watching me. As I parked near the main entrance, a figure emerged from a cottage nestled among the trees. He was impossibly old, his face weathered like driftwood, wearing clothes that belonged in a museum. When he walked, the forest seemed to part before him, and small animals followed in his wake like he was some kind of ancient druid. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing despite the distance. "I am Elias. I tend the grounds and have done so since before the manor's completion. The house has been preparing for your arrival." He handed me a brass key that felt warm despite the cool October air. "You were not the only bidder, you know. 7 others attempted to claim the inheritance, but the house rejected them all. You were chosen for specific qualities that will become apparent in time." "What kind of qualities?" I asked. Elias smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. Curiosity that overrides self-preservation. Intelligence that borders on obsession. And most importantly, a connection to the public that will amplify the house's influence when the time comes. He gestured towards the manor's main entrance, a massive oak door carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The previous inheritor left recently. He understood his role in the greater pattern and accepted his transformation with admirable grace. You'll find his final gifts throughout the house: recordings, writings, preparations for your own journey. The interior of Ashwood Manor was a masterpiece of impossible architecture. The main hall soared upward through what should have been multiple floors, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The spiral staircase curved around the room's perimeter, but I counted more steps going up than could possibly fit in the available space. The grandfather clock stood in the hall's centre, just as the photograph had shown, but in person I could see that the moon phases weren't painted. They were windows, and through them I glimpsed landscapes that existed under alien skies. The clock's pendulum swung in a rhythm that didn't match its ticking, and occasionally I thought I heard voices whispering from inside its wooden case. Every room was perfectly preserved, but wrong in subtle ways that made my journalist's instincts scream warnings. The library contained thousands of books, but many of the titles were in languages that had never existed on Earth. The conservatory housed not just the massive pipe organ, but also plants that shouldn't have been able to survive in this climate, orchids that pulsed like hearts, roses that grew in perfect geometric spirals, and in one corner a tree whose fruit looked disturbingly like human heads. I set up my recording equipment throughout the house, placing cameras and microphones in every major room. If something supernatural was going to happen, I wanted documentation that would hold up to scientific scrutiny. I was still thinking like a journalist then, still believing that truth and evidence were weapons that could protect me. The first rule activation came at 9 p.m, 3 hours after sunset. The bell tower chimed 13 times, each tone reverberating through the house with supernatural intensity. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves rather than the distant bells, and with each chime the temperature dropped by several degrees. I grabbed the journal and ran to the conservatory, my heart hammering as I searched for the crimson hymnal mentioned in Rule 1. The book sat open on the piano bench, its pages filled with musical notation that hurt to look at directly. The notes seemed to writhe and shift, forming patterns that suggested melodies from beyond human understanding. But when I placed my fingers on the keys, the music flowed from my hands as if I'd known it my entire life. The melody was hauntingly beautiful but wrong. Too many notes in each measure, harmonies that existed in frequencies human ears weren't designed to process. As I played it the first time, the house fell completely silent. Not just quiet, silent in a way that suggested the absence of existence itself. The second time, I heard voices joining the melody. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, singing in languages that predated human speech. The voices came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor itself, as if the house was filled with a choir of the damned. The third time, applause echoed from empty rooms. Not the enthusiastic clapping of an appreciative audience, but the mechanical applause of things that had learned to mimic human approval without understanding its meaning. The sound went on for exactly 60 seconds, then stopped with such abruptness that the silence afterward felt like a physical weight. When I finished playing, words appeared on the music stand, not written, but burned into the wood as if by invisible fire. "Welcome to the performance, Theodore. You play beautifully for a beginner." That night I explored the manor more thoroughly, trying to understand its layout and history. The wine cellar was extensive, carved from living rock and filled with bottles that probably worth millions. The brass thermometer in the kitchen read 48 degrees, well above the danger threshold mentioned in Rule 2, so I descended the stone steps to investigate. The bottles were arranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, their labels displaying dates that suggested some were far older than wine should be able to survive. But it was the mural on the far wall that stopped me cold, painted directly on the stone in pigments that seemed to glow in the darkness. It depicted the history of Ashwood Manor in disturbing detail. The first panel showed Cornelius Ashwood as a young man standing beside a beautiful woman and 3 smiling children. The second showed the same family, but now the woman and children were pale and thin, their eyes sunken with illness. The third panel was the most disturbing. Cornelius alone in a room filled with candles and strange symbols, his hands pressed against what looked like a crack in reality itself. The subsequent panels showed the results of whatever ritual he'd performed. Things began emerging from the crack. Tall, angular shapes that hurt to look at directly. Spheres of writhing darkness that seemed to absorb light, and worst of all, perfect copies of his dead family members, but with eyes that held no human warmth. As I studied the mural, the temperature began to drop. My breath became visible. Then my breath began to burn my lungs. Frost formed on the wine bottles, and in the ice I began to see faces. Previous owners of the house, their expressions frozen in eternal terror. The cold intensified with supernatural speed. My fingers went numb, then my hands, then my arms. But worse than the physical cold was the psychological effect. I felt my thoughts slowing, my memories crystallizing into fragile things that could shatter at any moment. In the growing ice on the walls, I saw my own face beginning to appear, my expression matching the terror of those who had come before. Then, just as I felt consciousness slipping away, the cellar door burst open. Elias stood at the top of the stairs holding a flamethrower, its blue flame cutting through the supernatural cold, like a sword of fire. "Quickly now," he shouted. "The frozen ones almost had you. They're always hungry for warmth, and you're still deliciously alive." I stumbled up the stairs, my body numb, but somehow still functioning. Elias examined me carefully, checking my extremities for signs of supernatural frostbite. "You're fortunate," he said. "Another minute and you would have joined them in the ice. They preserve consciousness, you see. The cold keeps you aware, but unable to move, unable to scream, unable to die. Just eternal observation of your own frozen horror." "How long have they been down there?" I asked through chattering teeth. The first appeared 3 days after Cornelius completed his great work, a travelling salesman who stumbled into the cellar during an unexpected cold snap. Cornelius found him frozen solid, but still blinking, still trying to speak. That's when he realised that what he'd summoned wasn't just opening doors, it was changing the fundamental rules of existence within the manor's walls. The next morning brought new horrors. I woke to the sound of singing, a woman's voice, operatic and powerful, but performing in a language that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to something deeper in my brain. The words filled me with inexplicable dread. Images of vast spaces between stars where things older than galaxies waited in patient hunger. Following Rule 3, I hurried to the library and selected a crimson-bound book from the shelves. It was a collection of poetry, but as I began reading aloud, the words on the page changed. Instead of the romantic verses I expected, I found myself reciting incantations in the same impossible language the singer was using. The singing grew angry as I continued reading. Books began flying from the shelves, their pages fluttering like wounded birds before settling into patterns on the floor that formed symbols I recognized from Cornelius's journal. The temperature dropped again, but this time it was a different kind of cold. Not the numbing freeze of the cellar, but a cold that burned, that reached into my chest and wrapped icy fingers around my heart. I kept reading, my voice growing hoarse as poem after poem spilled from my lips. But the words weren't coming from the book anymore. They were coming from somewhere deeper, as if the house was speaking through me. I was becoming a conduit for whatever force the opera singer represented, and with each word I spoke, I felt pieces of my humanity burning away like paper in a flame. Finally, after what felt like hours, the singing stopped, with a sound like breaking glass. The books fell to the floor in ordinary disorder, and the words on the page returned to normal English poetry. But I could still feel the echo of that other language in my throat, and when I spoke, my voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible for human vocal cords to produce. A note appeared on the library desk, written in the same hand that had penned the original rules. "Thank you for your assistance, Theodore. Your voice is quite suitable for our purposes. We look forward to using it more frequently." The weekend brought the lunar challenge. On Saturday evening, the grandfather clock's moon phase turned completely black. Not the dark grey of a new moon, but an absolute absence of light that seemed to pull illumination out of the surrounding air. I quickly built fires in every room with a fireplace, but the flames burned blue and cast no warmth. Through the windows I could see shapes moving in the darkness, tall, angular figures that seemed to bend light around them, making it impossible to focus on their true forms. They moved with predatory grace, circling the house in patterns that suggested intelligence but not humanity. As the night progressed, the entities grew bolder. They pressed against the windows with sounds like fingernails on glass, leaving marks that glowed faintly in the darkness. The fires began to flicker despite the absence of any wind, and I realized with growing horror that something was systematically extinguishing them from the inside. Following the marginalia in David's notes, I began feeding the flames with pieces of myself, a few strands of hair to the library fire, nail clippings to the conservatory, and finally, when the entities began pressing through the glass itself, drops of blood to the main hall fireplace. The effect was immediate and disturbing. The flames roared higher, burning with colours that had no names, and the house filled with the sound of screaming, not from the entities outside, but from the fires themselves. My blood, hair and nails were burning, but they were also merging with the house's structure, becoming part of its defence system. When dawn finally came, the entities faded back into the forest, but I could feel that something fundamental had changed. The house knew me now, in a way that was far more intimate than mere residence. It had tasted my essence, and I was no longer just an inheritor. I was becoming an ingredient. Sunday brought an unexpected snowstorm, and with it, the children from Rule 5. I first noticed them from the conservatory window. 5 small figures playing in the garden, their clothing Victorian in style. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like marionettes operated by drunk puppeteers. When one turned toward the house, I saw that it had no face, just smooth skin where features should have been, broken only by a horizontal slit that might have been a mouth. The sight should have been terrifying, but instead I felt an overwhelming urge to go outside and join their games. I closed the shutters quickly and retreated upstairs, but I could hear them playing for hours. Their laughter grew increasingly complex, starting as simple children's giggles but evolving into harmonies that suggested vast choirs, singing in frequencies below human hearing. Sometimes the laughter would pause and I would hear them calling names, not mine, but the names of previous inheritors, as if they were trying to summon the dead back to play. When I finally looked out an upstairs window the next morning, they were gone, but their footprints remained in the snow. The prints formed symbols that seemed to shift and change as I watched, spelling out messages in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Soon, Theodore. Soon you will join our eternal games. The portrait incident occurred during my second week. I had been documenting each room methodically, photographing every detail for my eventual exposé, when I entered the dining room to find Cornelius Ashwood's portrait facing the wall. The heavy frame had been completely reversed, and carved into the wood backing in fresh letters were the words, "He sees through your eyes now." I didn't hesitate. Following Rule 6 exactly, I ran through the kitchen and out the back door, fleeing to Elias's cottage without looking back. The old groundskeeper was waiting for me with a cup of tea, as if he'd known I would come. "It happens to everyone," he said calmly. "The house tests each inheritor differently, but Cornelius always makes himself known. During the second week, you handled it correctly." From the cottage, I could see lights moving through every window of the manor, as if someone was conducting a systematic search with an old-fashioned lantern. The lights moved in patterns that seemed too organized to be random, room by room, floor by floor, with occasional pauses at windows that faced the cottage. "What is he looking for?" I asked. "Evidence," Elias replied. proof that you're suitable for the final purpose. Each inheritor brings different skills, different knowledge, different connections to the outside world. Cornelius needs to understand how to best use what you offer. Use me for what? Elias set down his teacup and looked at me with eyes that were far older than his ancient face. The great work is nearly complete, Mr. Hartwell. For over a century, each inheritor has added to the house's power, each one serving as a battery to fuel its expansion beyond these walls. But you are special. Your podcast, your audience, your credibility. You will be the voice that prepares the world for what's coming. I spent that night in the cottage listening to Elias tell me the true history of Ashwood Manor. Cornelius hadn't just lost his family to tuberculosis. He had caused their deaths through his obsession with contacting the dead. His early experiments with spiritualism had attracted the attention of entities that existed in the spaces between realities, and they had taught him how to open permanent doorways between dimensions. The house itself was one vast summoning circle, its architecture designed according to principles that violated the laws of physics. Every room, every hallway, every decorative element served a purpose in maintaining the breach between worlds, and the inhabitants, the frozen ones in the cellar, the opera singer, the children in the snow, even the forest collective, were all refugees from dying realities drawn to the manor like moths to a flame. But they're not just hiding here, Elias explained. They're breeding, multiplying, preparing for the day when they'll be strong enough to expand beyond these walls and claim your entire world as their new home. I returned to the mansion at dawn, finding the portrait back in its proper position. But Cornelius Ashwood's painted eyes seemed different now. More knowing, more approving. And when I passed the portrait throughout the day, I sometimes caught glimpses of movement in the painted background, as if the two-dimensional image contained depth that physics shouldn't allow. The pipe organ incident began on Tuesday night. I was reviewing my recordings in the study when the massive instrument began playing by itself. The music was a funeral dirge, complex and mournful, but performed with inhuman precision that suggested thousands of fingers operating in perfect coordination. Following Rule 7, I retreated to the master bedroom and began covering all the mirrors with the black cloths provided in the room's wardrobe. But as I draped the last mirror, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. The reflection showed not the bedroom I was standing in, but a different room entirely, one filled with figures in Victorian dress conducting what appeared to be a massive séance. They sat in concentric circles around a raised platform where something writhed beneath a black sheet. The figures chanted in the same language I'd heard the opera singer use, and with each word, the thing under the sheet moved more violently. The music continued for hours, and even with all mirrors covered, I could hear movement in the reflections. Footsteps, whispers, the sound of furniture being rearranged by invisible hands. At one point, I heard my own voice coming from behind one of the covered mirrors, pleading for help in words I didn't remember speaking. When the organ finally fell silent, I removed the cloths to find the mirrors normal again. But the bedroom felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. And for the rest of my time at the manor, I sometimes caught glimpses of those Victorian figures in reflective surfaces throughout the house, always watching, always chanting, always preparing for something vast and terrible. My first seventh day arrived with a sense of impending doom that I felt in my bones. I had been dreading this moment since reading Rule 8, and as evening approached, I carefully placed the black candles in each window facing the forest. The candles were unlike any I'd seen before. They burned with flames that seemed to consume darkness itself, casting light that revealed things I wished remained hidden. At midnight, the forest collective emerged from the tree line. They weren't individuals, but a single organism that had learned to divide itself into separate components for hunting. Each figure was impossibly tall and thin, with bark-like skin and faces that shifted between human and tree-like features. They moved in perfect synchronization, their steps creating a rhythm that seemed to call up responses from deep within the earth. They circled the house in patterns that were part ritual, part hunting behavior. As they moved, the trees around the clearing began to lean inward, their branches reaching towards the manor like grasping fingers. I realized that the entire forest was part of the collective, and the individual figures were just its way of testing the house's defenses. One candle in the library began to flicker. I watched in horror as the flame grew smaller and smaller, the wax melting at an unnatural rate despite the cool night air. The forest collective seemed to sense the candle's weakness, their movements becoming more agitated, their circle tightening around the house. The moment the candle died, chaos erupted. The entities rushed towards the house from all directions, their tree-like forms dissolving into masses of writhing roots and grasping branches. They flowed through the broken window like a woody tsunami, filling the library with the sounds of creaking wood and rustling leaves. I ran to the basement, following the escape route Elias had shown me during my first week. Behind me, I could hear them spreading through the house, their root systems boring through walls and floors as they searched for organic matter to absorb. The sound was like a forest fire in reverse. Instead of destruction, it was aggressive growth, consumption, incorporation. The basement was where I made my most significant discovery. Hidden behind a false wall was Cornelius Ashwood's true workshop. Not just a ritual chamber, but a laboratory, where he had spent decades perfecting the art of dimensional manipulation. The room was filled with equipment that shouldn't have existed in 1891. Devices that generated fields of force that bent space around them. Instruments that measured energies that had no names in human science. And in the center of it all, a machine that I recognized with growing horror. It was a printing press, but one designed to print more than words. The type was made from crystallized screams, the ink from liquefied nightmares, and the paper from the compressed dreams of the dead. This was how Cornelius had created the journal, how he had ensured that each new inheritor would follow the rules exactly as intended. But the press had been upgraded over the decades. David Chen's architectural knowledge had been incorporated into its design, along with the technological understanding of previous inheritors. Now it was capable of printing more than just journals. It could create entire buildings, transforming the written word into physical reality. Scattered around the press were blueprints for structures that could be built in major cities around the world. Each blueprint was annotated with notes about optimal locations, population density, and the supernatural resources needed for construction. The Forest Collective wasn't trying to reclaim the house. They were providing the raw materials for its reproduction. I understood then that everything that had happened to me, every rule I had followed, every supernatural encounter I had survived, had been building toward this moment. The house wasn't just feeding on my fear. It was harvesting my experiences, my knowledge of media and communication, my understanding of how to reach large audiences. My podcast had given it exactly what it needed. A credible voice that people would trust. A platform that could spread its influence far beyond these walls. Above me, the sounds of the Forest Collective's rampage continued, but I noticed something disturbing. They weren't destroying the house, they were integrating with it. Through the ceiling, I could see roots spreading in precise patterns, reinforcing the structure rather than damaging it. The attack was actually a construction project, and I was witnessing the house's metamorphosis into something far more dangerous. A sound behind me made me turn. In the shadows at the far end of the workshop, something was moving. Not the jerky, unnatural movement of the entities I'd encountered so far, but the smooth, purposeful stride of something that had once been human. "Theodore," came a voice I recognized from my own recordings. David Chen stepped into the light, but he was no longer entirely human. His skin had a bark-like texture. His eyes glowed with the same pale light I'd seen in the Forest Collective, and when he moved, I could hear the sound of roots growing beneath his feet. "You came down here just as I knew you would," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke directly to the base of my brain, "just as Margaret did before me, and Thomas before her, and Elizabeth before him. We all discover the truth in this room, and we all make the same choice." "What choice?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. David gestured to a chair positioned in front of the printing press. It was ornate, carved from a single piece of what looked like human bone, with restraints built into the arms and a helmet-like device suspended above the headrest. "You can fight the house's influence and die slowly, piece by piece, over the next several weeks until nothing remains of Theodore Hartwell but echoes in the walls," he said. "Or you can accept your role willingly and help us create something beautiful, a world where the barriers between realities are finally torn down, where humanity can evolve beyond its current limitations." "You mean where humanity becomes food for things that should never have existed?" I countered. David smiled, and his teeth were perfect whitewood. "Perspective, Theodore. What you call food, we call integration. What you see as horror, we experience as transcendence. The fear you feel is just the growing pains of becoming something greater." He began moving toward me with that same predatory grace I'd observed in all the Manor's supernatural inhabitants. "The choice was never really yours anyway. The moment you accepted the inheritance, you became part of the house's digestive system. I'm just offering you the chance to retain some semblance of yourself in the final configuration." I backed away from him, but there was nowhere to go. The basement workshop was a dead end, and above us, the Forest Collective had finished its integration with the house. The sounds of construction had stopped, replaced by a deep, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from the building's very foundation. "The others fought," David continued, still advancing. "Margaret lasted 3 weeks before the house consumed her completely. Thomas made it to 5 weeks, but the effort drove him insane. You're stronger than they were, more useful. The house wants to preserve your podcast persona, your ability to communicate with the masses. You'll become its voice, spreading the word about the wonders we're creating here." The chair was behind me now, its bone surface warm to the touch despite the basement's chill. The helmet device above it hummed with energy that made my teeth ache, and I could see cables running from it to the printing press, creating a direct connection between consciousness and creation. "What happens to the world if I agree?" I asked, stalling for time while trying to think of any possible escape. "Evolution," David said simply. "The house will begin reproducing, spreading to every major city on Earth. Each new structure will serve as a nursery for entities from dying realities, giving them new homes while transforming human civilization into something far more interesting. Your species has spent too long trapped in linear thinking, limited perception, mundane existence. We're offering upgrade packages." Above us, the humming grew louder, and I felt the house's attention focusing on our conversation like a massive eye opening in the darkness. The very air around us began to thicken, taking on a consistency that was part atmosphere, part consciousness, part hunger. "The Forest Collective is just the beginning," David continued. "They're the construction crew, the foundation builders. But we have entities from hundreds of different realities ready to immigrate to your dimension. Artists who paint with living light, musicians who compose symphonies from the screams of stars, architects who build structures that exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Your world will become a playground for impossible beauty. And humanity will adapt or be adapted. The choice is theirs just as this choice is yours." I felt the chair pressing against my legs, its bone surface beginning to grow around me like a living thing. The helmet device descended slowly, crackling with energies that promised transformation beyond anything human consciousness could survive intact. But in that moment of absolute terror, I heard something that gave me hope. The sound of my own voice coming from the recording equipment I'd left running in the study above. My podcast was still broadcasting, still transmitting to my audience of 3 million listeners. Even if the house consumed me completely, there was still a chance that someone would piece together the truth from my recordings. "You hear that?" I said to David, tilting my head toward the ceiling. "That's my voice reaching people all over the world right now. If I disappear, they'll come looking." And unlike the isolated disappearances of previous inheritors, my vanishing will be public, documented, impossible to cover up. David's bark-like face showed what might have been concern. The house has ways of managing such complications. Does it? Because I've been documenting everything, broadcasting live, uploading to multiple servers with dead man switches. If I don't check in every 24 hours, everything gets released automatically. Video footage of the supernatural encounters, audio recordings of your voice right now, digital evidence that will be impossible to dismiss as fiction. This was partially true. I'd been documenting everything, though the dead man switches were a bluff. But David didn't know that, and I could see uncertainty creeping into his inhuman features. "The house can reach into digital networks," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It can corrupt data, influence perception, make people forget what they've seen." "Not if the data is already distributed across thousands of servers worldwide," I lied smoothly. "Not if it's embedded in blockchain networks that exist beyond any single point of failure. Your supernatural influence might be vast, but it's still localized to this dimensional space. My evidence exists in quantum states across multiple data centers." The helmet device paused in its descent, and I felt the house's attention wavering, uncertainty creeping into its vast consciousness like a crack in a dam. "Besides," I continued, pressing my advantage, "think about the implications. If you consume me, you lose the very thing that makes me valuable. My credibility, my audience's trust, my ability to communicate effectively. A puppeted version of Theodore Hartwell won't have the same impact as the real thing choosing to cooperate." David stepped back, his root-like feet scratching against the stone floor. Above us, the humming faltered, and I could feel the house reconsidering its approach. "What are you proposing?" David asked. "A partnership," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I continue my podcast, but I gradually introduce concepts that prepare humanity for what's coming. Instead of fighting the inevitable, I help ease the transition, make the transformation seem like evolution rather than invasion." The helmet device retracted completely, and the chair's bone arms loosened their grip on my legs. The house was listening, considering, calculating the potential benefits of my proposal against the risks of letting me maintain some degree of autonomy. "You would willing serve as our herald?" David asked, "knowing what we intend for your species?" "I would serve as a bridge," I corrected. "Someone who helps both sides understand each other. The transformation is going to happen regardless. At least this way, fewer people suffer unnecessarily." David studied me with those glowing eyes, and I could feel other presences examining my proposal. The opera singer, the children in the snow, the forest collective, and behind them all, the vast intelligence that had once been Cornelius Ashwood. "The house finds your offer intriguing," David finally said, "but it requires proof of your commitment, a demonstration that you truly understand your new role." "What kind of demonstration?" David gestured to the printing press, its crystallized type gleaming in the workshop's strange light. "Record an episode, right now while the house listens. Show us how you would introduce our concepts to your audience. Prove that you can be our voice without losing the authenticity that makes you valuable." I approached the press slowly, my hands shaking as I touched its impossible mechanisms. The type was warm beneath my fingers, and I could feel the accumulated screams that had been compressed into each letter, The ink reservoir bubbled with liquid nightmares, and the paper was soft as human skin. But I had to try. If there was any chance of warning people, of preparing them for what was coming, I had to take it, even if it meant compromising my soul in the process. "This is Theodore Hartwell," I began, my voice carrying through the basement as the press began to work, translating my words into more than mere text. "Welcome to a very special episode of Shadows and Whispers. I'm broadcasting to you live from a location that will change everything you think you know about reality." The press hummed with increasing intensity as I spoke, and I could feel my words being transformed into something far more powerful than simple communication. Each sentence was becoming a vector for influence, a tool for reshaping human perception on a fundamental level. For years, I've investigated supernatural phenomena on the assumption that they were anomalies, exceptions to the natural order that needed to be exposed and explained, I continued. But I've discovered something far more profound. These phenomena aren't violations of reality. They're previews of what reality is becoming. Above us, the house pulsed with approval, and I felt a sickening warmth spread through my chest. The press was connecting me to the Manor's consciousness, making me a conduit for its influence rather than just a victim of it. "The barriers between dimensions are thinning," I said, my voice taking on harmonics that shouldn't have been possible for human vocal cords. "Entities from other realities are beginning to cross over, not as invaders, but as refugees seeking new homes. And they're bringing gifts, technologies, art forms, ways of thinking that will elevate humanity beyond its current limitations." The words were mine, but I could feel the house shaping them, guiding them, ensuring that they would have the maximum impact on anyone who heard them. My audience would listen to this episode and come away feeling curious rather than terrified, excited rather than horrified. "I've made contact with these entities," I continued, "and they've shown me wonders beyond imagination. Cities that exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Music composed from the harmony of dying stars. Art that transcends the limitations of three-dimensional space. They want to share these gifts with humanity, but only if we're ready to receive them." David watched approvingly as I spoke, his bark-like features showing something that might have been pride. The press continued its work, each word becoming a weapon designed to prepare humanity for its own transformation. "Over the coming weeks, I'll be sharing recordings of my conversations with these entities," I said, knowing that I was sealing my fate with every word. "You'll hear their voices, learn their stories, understand their intentions, and you'll come to realize, as I have, that what we call supernatural is simply natural from a broader perspective." The episode continued for 47 minutes, during which I became something I'd never wanted to be, a willing collaborator in humanity's destruction. But I told myself it was necessary. The cooperation was better than annihilation. That gradual transformation was preferable to sudden conquest. When I finished recording, the press fell silent, but I could feel its work continuing in ways that extended far beyond the physical realm. My words were spreading through digital networks, finding their way to every device connected to the internet, embedding themselves in the consciousness of everyone who heard them. "Well done," David said, and I could hear similar approval from the other entities throughout the house. "You've passed the first test. The house will allow you to continue your work, but remember, you belong to us now. Every word you speak, every thought you think serves our greater purpose." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I had bought myself time, perhaps even saved humanity from a more brutal transformation, but the cost was becoming clearer with every passing moment. I was no longer Theodore Hartwell, investigative journalist. I was Theodore Hartwell, herald of the apocalypse. The basement workshop began to change around us. The walls grew transparent, showing me glimpses of the other realities that the house connected to. I saw cities built from crystallized music, forests where the trees were made of living light, oceans that flowed upward into skies filled with swimming leviathans. "This is what we're offering your species," David said, gesturing to the impossible vistas. Not destruction, but expansion. Not death, but transformation into something greater than human imagination has ever conceived. And despite everything I knew about the house's true nature, despite the horror of what I'd just done, I felt a terrible sense of wonder at the beauty of it all. The entities weren't lying about the gifts they brought. They were offering genuine transcendence, evolution beyond anything humanity had ever dreamed possible. The problem was that transcendence and humanity couldn't coexist. Whatever emerged from the transformation would be beautiful, magnificent, impossible, but it wouldn't be human. And I was helping to make it happen. Over the following days, I continued my work as the house's herald, recording episodes that gradually prepared my audience for the changes to come. Each broadcast was more influential than the last, reaching deeper into human consciousness, reshaping perception on a fundamental level. My audience grew exponentially. The episodes went viral in ways that defied normal patterns of digital distribution, finding their way to people who had never heard of my podcast before, appearing in their feeds and playlists without any algorithm to explain their presence. The house was spreading its influence through my voice, using my credibility to open minds that would have rejected direct supernatural contact. But with each episode, I felt more of myself slipping away. The boundary between my thoughts and the house's intentions became increasingly blurred. Sometimes I would find myself speaking words I hadn't planned, expressing ideas that horrified the small part of me that remained genuinely human. The other entities began visiting me regularly, no longer hiding their presence. The opera singer taught me songs in the language of unbeing, melodies that could reshape reality through pure sound. The children from the snow showed me games that existed in 17 dimensions, playtime activities that prepared human consciousness for existence beyond linear time. Even the frozen ones emerged from the wine cellar, their ice-preserved forms carrying knowledge of civilizations that had existed before heat was invented. They spoke in whispers that turned breath to snow, sharing memories of worlds where cold was the highest form of life, and warmth was a brief, tragic aberration. I documented all of it, turning each encounter into content that made the impossible seem not just possible, but inevitable. My audience began reporting strange dreams, unusual sensitivities to temperature and light, glimpses of things that shouldn't exist in peripheral vision. The transformation was beginning, spread through digital signals and electromagnetic radiation, carried by sound waves and quantum entanglement. But it was during my third week as the house's herald that I made my final discovery, the one that would either damn me completely or offer a last, desperate chance at redemption. Hidden in Cornelius Ashwood's original journal, written in ink that only became visible under specific lighting conditions, was a warning meant for the eighth inheritor, the very person I had become. "If you read these words," the hidden text began, "then you have already fallen further than any of your predecessors. You have become willing, and in that willingness lies both the greatest danger and the only remaining hope." The text continued, revealing Cornelius's final secret. The house wasn't just a portal between realities. It was a prison designed to contain entities that had already destroyed countless worlds. His great work hadn't been summoning them here, but trapping them here, preventing them from spreading to other dimensions. The transformation they offered wasn't evolution, it was digestion. They consumed entire realities, absorbing their energy and leaving behind empty shells that looked like improved versions of the original. Every world they elevated became another layer of their infinite feeding ground. The eighth inheritor was always meant to be the key, Cornelius's hidden text explained. Someone with the ability to communicate across vast networks, to spread influence beyond physical boundaries. But that same ability can be turned against them. The choice is yours, Theodore. serve as their herald, or become their executioner. Buried beneath the basement workshop was a device Cornelius had spent decades perfecting, a reversal mechanism that could turn the house's entire purpose inside out. Instead of opening doors between realities, it would seal them permanently. Instead of summoning entities, it would banish them. Instead of transforming humanity, it would preserve it. But using the device would require a sacrifice that made everything I'd suffered so far seem trivial by comparison. The reversal process needed a consciousness powerful enough to serve as its focal point, someone who had been partially transformed, but retained enough humanity to choose annihilation over transcendence. It would mean my death, not just physical death, but the complete erasure of everything I had ever been or could ever become. No afterlife, no continuation, no echo in the cosmic background radiation. Just absolute, final nothing. As I stood in the hidden chamber beneath the workshop, staring at the device that could save or damn humanity depending on my choice, I felt the house's attention focusing on me, like a solar flare of alien consciousness. It knew what I had discovered, knew what I was contemplating, and it was afraid. For the first time since I'd arrived at Ashwood Manor, the entities were afraid. The device was simple in appearance, a metal sphere covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Cables ran from it to connection points throughout the house's foundation, creating a network that mirrored, but inverted the summoning circle's configuration. All I had to do was place my hands on the sphere and speak a single word: return. The device would activate, the portals would reverse, and every entity that had ever used the house as a gateway would be pulled back to their original realities. The process would unravel the house's supernatural structure, collapse the dimensional bridges, and restore the natural barriers between worlds. It would also completely destroy anyone who had been transformed by the house's influence, including me. I could feel David approaching from behind, his root-like footsteps scratching against the stone floor. "Step away from the device, Theodore," he said, his voice carrying undertones of genuine desperation. "You don't understand what you're considering." "I understand perfectly," I replied, my hands hovering inches from the sphere's surface. "I understand that everything you've shown me, every wonder and transcendence and evolutionary gift, is just the lure on a cosmic fishing hook. You're not refugees seeking new homes. You're parasites looking for new hosts." "The distinction is meaningless," David said, moving closer. "What matters is the result. Humanity will become something greater than it ever could have been alone." "Humanity will become you," I corrected. "And you'll become whatever consumed the civilizations you came from. It's parasites all the way down, isn't it? An infinite hierarchy of consumption, each level thinking it's achieving transcendence while actually being digested by the level above." Behind David, I could see other entities gathering. The opera singer, the children, the frozen ones, all of them radiating the same desperate fear. They had spent over a century building toward this moment, investing everything in the transformation of human civilization. The possibility of failure, of being sent back to their dying realities, was literally unthinkable to them. "You can't save them, you know," David said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that sounded wrong coming from his bark-like features. "Your species is already changing. The broadcasts have reached millions of people, planted seeds that will grow regardless of what happens here. Even if you activate the device, humanity will continue evolving towards us." "Maybe," I admitted, "but at least they'll have a chance to choose their own path instead of having it forced on them." I could feel the house's consciousness pressing against my mind, offering me visions of the wonders that awaited if I abandoned my foolish human sentimentality. I saw myself conducting interviews with entities that existed as pure mathematics, recording conversations with beings made of crystallized time, hosting discussions between creatures that had learned to compose symphonies from the birth cries of galaxies. It was beautiful. It was magnificent. It was everything I had ever wanted as a journalist. Access to infinite stories, unlimited knowledge, perspectives that transcended human understanding. And it was all a lie designed to keep me from destroying them. "The choice is yours, Theodore," David said, now standing close enough that I could smell the forest loam that comprised his transformed flesh. "But remember, once you activate that device, there's no going back, no second chances, no alternative endings. You'll be erasing yourself from existence for the sake of preserving a species that will probably destroy itself within a few centuries anyway." He was right, of course. Humanity was flawed, violent, short-sighted, prone to the same cycles of consumption and expansion that had apparently infected every intelligent species in the universe. We might survive the entity's banishment only to extinct ourselves through war, environmental destruction, or simple stupidity. But that was our choice to make. I placed my hands on the sphere. The metal was warm, pulsing with energy that felt like a heartbeat made of electricity and mathematics. The symbols on its surface began glowing, creating patterns that spoke directly to the visual cortex, bypassing normal perception to convey meaning in ways that language couldn't match. "Return," I said, and felt reality begin to unravel around me. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every supernatural entity in the house screamed simultaneously, not with their voices, but with their entire existence, creating a sound that existed in frequencies beyond human hearing. The walls began to bleed light, and through the cracks I could see the vast spaces between realities, the cosmic voids where things that should never have existed waited in patient hunger. David lunged toward me, his bark-like form dissolving into a mass of writhing roots and grasping branches. But the device's activation had created a barrier around me, a shell of reversed reality that nothing could penetrate. He crashed against it like a wave against a sea wall, his desperate fury unable to reach me. One by one, the entities began to fade. The children in the snow were the first to go, their faceless forms becoming transparent before vanishing entirely. The opera singer's voice rose to a final, impossible crescendo before cutting off mid-note. Even the frozen ones cracked like ice in sunlight, their preserved consciousnesses finally finding the peace of true death. But the house fought back. I could feel its vast intelligence focusing on the device, trying to corrupt its function, turn its purpose inside out. The symbols on the sphere began changing, their meaning shifting from return to consume, from banish to transform. That's when I realized that Cornelius had built a final safeguard into the device. It required continuous, conscious intent to maintain its function. The moment my focus wavered, the moment my resolve weakened, the reversal would become another summoning, more powerful than anything the house had ever attempted. I had to maintain perfect concentration while reality collapsed around me, while every supernatural entity in existence screamed for my death, while the house itself tried to rewrite my consciousness from the inside out. I had to hold on to the idea of return, while everything I had ever known or been was systematically erased. The pain was indescribable. Not physical pain, the device had moved beyond such crude concepts, but the agony of having my existence unraveled thread by thread. Every memory, every experience, every thought and dream and fear was being pulled out of me and fed into the reversal process. I felt my childhood disappearing first. Birthday parties and scraped knees and the smell of my mother's perfume, all of it dissolving into the cosmic background radiation. Then, my education, my career, my relationships, everything that had made me Theodore Hartwell vanishing as if it had never existed. But I held on to the word. Even as my name became meaningless, even as my identity scattered like leaves in a hurricane, I maintained my focus on that single concept: return. The house's screams reached a crescendo that shattered windows throughout the structure. Cracks appeared in the walls, not physical fissures, but rips in the fabric of reality itself. Through them, I could see the entities being pulled back to their original dimensions, dragged kicking and screaming into the dying realities they had tried to escape. David was the last to go. As his root-like form began to fade, he looked at me with something that might have been respect. "You magnificent fool," he said, his voice already echoing from impossibly distant dimensions. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." But I did know. I could see it all now. My consciousness expanded beyond human limitations in the final moments before its destruction. The entities hadn't just been refugees. They had been containment measures, living barriers designed to prevent something even worse from breaking through. By banishing them, I had removed the cosmic equivalent of a cork from a bottle that contained horrors beyond description. But that was a problem for the future. Right now, in this moment, humanity was free to make its own mistakes, create its own horrors, achieve its own transcendence or destruction on its own terms. The device completed its work, and I felt the last traces of my existence dissolving into quantum foam. The house collapsed around me, its impossible architecture unable to maintain coherence without the entities that had given it structure. The dimensional portals sealed themselves, the supernatural energies dissipated, and Ashwood Manor became just another abandoned building in the Adirondack wilderness. But my final act was to ensure that the evidence survived. As my consciousness fragmented, I pushed every recording, every piece of documentation, every warning about what had happened here into the quantum networks that connected all digital systems. The truth would survive, even if I couldn't, scattered across millions of servers and embedded in the collective unconscious of everyone who had ever heard my voice. In my last moment of awareness, I felt a presence that might have been Cornelius Ashwood himself, finally free from the house's influence. "Thank you," he whispered across the dimensional void. "You have finished what I was too proud to complete." Then everything went white, then black, then nothing at all. The reports came in sporadically over the following months. Ashwood Manor had been found collapsed, its ruins showing no signs of supernatural activity. Investigators discovered evidence of recent habitation. My equipment, my recordings, my research, but no trace of what had happened to me. My final podcast episodes continued to circulate, but their content had changed. Instead of preparing humanity for transformation, they now served as warnings about the dangers that lurked in the spaces between realities. The supernatural influence that had shaped them was gone, replaced by my genuine voice speaking truths that I had died to preserve. Some people listened and learned. Others dismissed the warnings as elaborate fiction, but the seeds of knowledge were planted, growing in minds that might one day face similar choices, similar threats, similar opportunities to choose humanity's future. The entities were gone, banished to their dying realities, but the universe was vast, and other things moved in the cosmic dark, things that the entities had been holding back, things that would eventually turn their attention toward Earth and find it undefended. That battle would be fought by others, in other times, with other choices. I had won this war, but at the cost of everything I was or ever could have been. And in the end, as consciousness faded into the ultimate silence, I decided it was worth it. Humanity would endure. It would face new horrors, overcome new challenges, make new mistakes, and achieve new wonders. But it would do so as itself, unchanged by forces beyond its understanding, free to become whatever it chose to become. Even if I wasn't around to see it happen,